Okay, we'll just give it another couple of minutes for people to join us. Okay, Katie, why don't you say something about how we want the Q&A to go? I'll start off and say welcome to this first Monday forum, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Ambassador Paul Brummell to speak about his book, Diplomatic Gifts, A History in 50 Presents, and how that relates to public diplomacy. But before we do that, Katie, why don't you set up the ground rules for Q&A?
Sounds great. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so happy to have you at this month's First Monday Forum. So today's speaker will be happy to take your questions following his initial remarks and also following Dr. Cole's first few questions. So if you do have questions, please use the Zoom webinar's Q&A window, which can be accessed by clicking the icon with 2 speech bubbles at the center of the bottom of your screen. That is, if you're using the desktop version of Zoom. It might look slightly different if you're attending from a phone or other mobile device, but again, please use the Q&A window. We also ask that you include your name and affiliation when you type a question. If you experience any technical issues, you're welcome to send me a message using the chat box, which can be found by clicking the icon with 1 speech bubble that's on the right of your screen. You can also use this chat box to introduce yourself to other attendees, but again, please keep all speaker questions to the Q&A window. So I know there are a bunch of speech bubbles, but the Q&A will be the best way for us to field your questions.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm Nick Cull. I'm speaking to you from the Center on Communication, Leadership and Policy, which is co-sponsoring this meeting of the Public Diplomacy Council of America's First Monday group. And it's a great pleasure this morning to welcome Ambassador Paul Brummell, who is presently British Ambassador to Latvia, to speak about his work on diplomatic gifts. Paul is a distinguished British career diplomat. He was born in 1965 and has served as ambassador in multiple posts in both Central Asia and Eastern Europe. He served as High Commissioner to Barbados, with larger responsibilities for British relations in the Caribbean. And then from 2018 to 2021, he was the senior official in the soft power unit of the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as it was then. His previous publications include travel guides to Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, written during his time as ambassador to those countries. So welcome, Paul. And what I'd like to do to kick off is if you just introduce us a little bit to your book and how you see it relating specifically to the world of public diplomacy and soft power that we share.
Nick, thank you very much, and it's great to join you all. So I think the idea of writing a book on diplomatic gifts came to me as I was wandering Vienna with my then 6-year-old son in 2019. I was a few days as trailing spouse while my wife was speaking at a public health conference. And we'd been to the Prater Fun Fair in the morning for George, so it was time for my choice in the afternoon. So we went to the Hofburg Imperial Palace. And I remember we reached a room absolutely stuffed full of glass cases, and they were displaying items of porcelain. And looking a bit more closely, all of them were from the same service, so actually beautifully decorated with entwined green ribbons with sort of garlands of fruit descending from them, dozens of them. And the signage told us, or rather it kind of told me, because George by that stage was just playing video games with his iPad, I think, that this was a gift from Louis XV, King of France, to Maria Theresia, the Holy Roman Empress, in 1759. And as you say, I mean, my career has been that of a diplomat, and I thought to my own experience of gifts, and they tend to be, visiting minister, exchanging a nice gift with the host at the end of a meeting or after a nice lunch. Gift, an item intended to please, intended to represent the United Kingdom in a small way, but something quite notional, a House of Commons cufflinks or a box of Fortnum and Mason tea. There'll often have been a phone call before the meeting with the host organisers to agree on a gift exchange and roughly inquire about the value to ensure there's no embarrassment caused by imbalance of lavishness. But overall, the gift has tended to be quite trivial in value. So in writing the book, the questions I sought to examine were whether such gifts have indeed gradually declined in value through history, and if so, why? And in any case, why is there a link between diplomacy and gifts in the first place? And the key work on gifts, on the exchange of gifts, is something called Essai sur le don. It was written in 1925 by Marcel Mauss, a nephew of Emile Durkheim. And the kind of Morse's central contention is that the gift economy has a social function. So it's different from commodity exchange. In commodity exchange, there's no enduring link generated between buyer and seller. In gift exchange, the very act of giving binds the giver and receiver together. And so diplomacy, if you think about it, is all about the conduct of business between geographically distinct groups. Its origins lie back in prehistory, where one group of cave dwellers needed to grant an emissary the ability to deliver unmolested a message to another group. And this conduct of business between distinct groups is facilitated by a continuing social relationship, and hence the importance of diplomatic gifts as a means of establishing and then maintaining these relationships. But while, as per Morse, a social function is at the heart of diplomatic gifts, they do other things too. So they can serve as symbols of authority. And this is the kind of exchange which was envisaged by US anthropologist Alan Fiske when he talks about relationships of authority ranking. These are uneven relationships, one of the parties giving lavishly, the other awed by or dependent on their benevolence. So gifts in this category are almost characterized by contempt on the part of the giver. And some specific diplomatic gifts have been used as symbols of authority. Robes of honor, or hilat in Ottoman Turkish, are the kind of classic example. They were gifted by Ottoman sultans, but only ever from a superior to an inferior. It's a symbol of the ruler's trust and protection. Acceptance is a mark of receiver's loyalty to the sultan. So when a robe of honor was given by the Timurid ruler Shah Rukh to the Mamluk Sultan Barsbai, the latter was so incensed, he ordered the waterboarding of the unfortunate Timurid envoy. So gifts can also serve as instruments of soft power. They can kind of showcase the technological achievements, cultural sophistication, or just all-round attractiveness of the gifting polity. Good example here is use by Cuban President Fidel Castro of cigars, who typically present a gift of Cohiba cigars in personally autographed wooden boxes. And Cohiba was established in the 1960s specifically as a brand for Castro's presents, produced in small quantities, not available on a commercial basis until the 1980s. And the use of Cohiba cigars as gifts offered two big advantages for Castro. First, because the brand was so closely associated with him personally, they served to kind of demonstrate the personal nature of the gift. The cigars were perceived as Castro's own. And second, they served as an advert for the Cuban cigar industry at a time when it needed to reassert its credentials as the best in the world. But whether they're as kind of tools for social relationships or symbols of authority or instruments of soft power, I think there's one really key underpinning consideration underlying all diplomatic gifts, which is in a sense obvious, but it also warrants underlining, which is that gifts are chosen to serve the interests of the giver. And I think the most extreme example of this is the Trojan Horse. You know, the long Trojan War, punctuated by deeds both heroic and cruel, had reached a stalemate. It was ended, but not by some wonderful feat of military brilliance on the battlefield, but by trickery. Odysseus's plan involved a wooden horse packed with Greek soldiers. It was presented to the Trojans with a plaque, which read, "For their return home, the Greeks dedicate this thank offering to Athena," which is something like the modern day compliments card. The gift delivered in one sense a great victory for the Greeks, but the gods were angered by the underhand nature of it all and the brutal Greek behavior. And so they punished the Greeks by delivering a fierce storm as their fleet returned home. So in the end, there weren't any winners. Lest it be thought that gifts concealing a nasty surprise within are confined to the realms of Greek mythology, consider the delightfully carved wooden plaque of the Great Seal of the United States, which was
Yes.
presented to US ambassador in Moscow in 1945 by a delegation of Soviet young pioneers. It's a symbol of the friendship between the two wartime allies. And the ambassador, a man called W. Averell Harriman, he loved this thing and he put it up in his study and greatly admired it. And it wasn't until 1951 that it was discovered that it had a listening device concealed within it. A Trojan horse for the 20th century. So in looking at diplomatic gifts across history, I think one does get a clear sense that the value of these gifts declines over time. So in my book, the first example I give is the Amarna letters. And these are, if you don't know them, they're an amazing set of diplomatic correspondence of the 14th century BCE. They're written in Akkadian cuneiform on small clay tablets that were discovered in 1887. In the ruins of Akhetaten, the purpose-built capital of Pharaoh Akhenaten. And the letters kind of include a whole series of great king correspondence between the five great powers of the day. And what's really interesting is that diplomatic gifts are right at the heart of all of the correspondence. And the rulers have absolutely no hesitation in setting out what they want, sometimes specifying the desired quantity too. And what the other kings wanted from Egypt is almost always gold, loads of it. So Zeta, brother of the Hittite king, sent the pharaoh a gift of 16 men. And he writes, please send him to the pharaoh, please send me gold in return and let me know whatever else you would like in return for it. And if you compare these gifts with the objects given by prominent leaders in our own century, so for example, a pair of R.M. Williams boots, given in 2014 by Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott to his Japanese counterpart, thoughtful, well-chosen gifts, but not really at the heart of diplomatic engagements. So what seems to have happened is that the gifts used in diplomacy have moved from items of high material value, powering exchanges between polities, to items of more symbolic value, regarded as a diplomatic nicety. And I think to kind of understand this process, it's interesting to consider a miniature portrait of Louis XVI of France, encircled by 408 diamonds, presented by the French king to the departing US minister to France in 1785. That was Benjamin Franklin. And from the French president, from the French perspective, this was a really kind of standard sort of diplomatic gift. It was called a boîte à portrait. From the American perspective, it was problematic because Enlightenment America took a very different attitude to gifts from the absolute monarchy of France. Franklin was terrified he would be criticized as beholden to the corrupting influences of the French. So he kind of puts his dilemma to Congress, which allows him to keep the gift. And so what he does, eventually bequeaths it in his will to his daughter, Sarah, though on condition, and I think this is a wonderful condition in his will, that she would not form any of those diamonds into ornaments and thereby introduce or countenance the expensive, vain and useless fashion of wearing jewels in this country. And she kind of sort of complies with this. She doesn't doesn't turn any of the ornaments, any of the diamonds into jewelry. She does, though, turn some of them into cash. And by the time the portrait arrives into the care of the American Philosophical Society in 1959, just 1 diamond out of the 408 remained. So at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, this kind of lavish gift was very much on delegates' minds. They fretted over the dangers that the old powers of Europe might try to corrupt political life in their young state through gifts and favours. And so what they did was devise the emoluments clause of the Constitution. So no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of the Congress, accept of any present emolument, office or title of any kind whatsoever from any king, prince or foreign state. And so diplomatic gifts had started a transition from personal to regulated transactions. And today, many countries set limits on the value of diplomatic gifts that can be given or received. But then there's another really sort of key consideration in diplomatic gifts, which is reciprocation. And Morse identifies 3 key obligations as central, indispensable to gift exchange. So the obligation to give presents, the obligation to receive them, and the obligation to repay gifts received. Reciprocation is vital to the system's stability. So think about a case which doesn't seem to involve reciprocation, the thank you gift. So such as the Christmas tree, which is given to the City of London annually since 1947 by the City of Oslo in Norway in recognition of British support for the Norwegian king and government in exile. In a kind of distinct case of looking a gift horse in the mouth, the tree often seems to incur UK press sniping about its rather Spartan nature. And in 2019, I thought rather brilliantly came to its own defense by commenting on its Twitter account, it does indeed have one, at Trafalgar Tree, I thought I'd left the trolls behind in Norway. But even here, gifts such as the Norwegian Christmas tree are reciprocations. They replace a feeling of indebtedness with an ongoing positive social relationship, reinforced by an annual gift. But while reciprocation remains central to diplomatic gifting, what has changed over time is the time lag between gift and return gift. So a diplomatic delegation sent by Charlemagne to the Abbasid Caliph in 797 arrived back in Aachen only 5 years later with Harun al-Rashid's wonderful gift of an elephant. Today's diplomatic gifts are usually immediately reciprocated at face-to-face meetings of leaders. And sociologist Pierre Bourdieu suggests that to maintain the social relationship at the heart of a system of gift exchange, a time lag is essential. Immediate reciprocation discharges all obligations too quickly. And so what we seem to be seeing in modern day diplomatic gifting is that this combination of the placing of limits on the value of gifts that may be given or received and the tendency immediately to reciprocate gifts provides a safety mechanism, avoiding the obligations typically generated by a gift. What happens is this weakens the ability of these gifts to maintain the social relationships at the heart of gift exchange. They seem to fulfill a different, rather lesser function, artifacts of non-verbal diplomatic signalling. But something else has changed over time, and that's around the actors. The actors involved both in the selection of gifts and as the intended audience of the gifts are different. Consider those early gifts described in the Amarna letters. They were the personal gifts. They're personal gifts of rulers to other rulers. Other actors are involved, notably as messengers accompanying the gifts, but they're clearly personal transactions. The boîte à portrait presented by Louis XVI to Benjamin Franklin emphasizes the personal nature of the gift in a particularly clear way. The gift itself is a portrait of the giver, surrounded by diamonds to enhance its value and prestige, but it's not alienable from the person of the giver. As diplomacy itself becomes more public, so too does the gift. So just to give an example, consider 2 gifts of giraffes. And the widespread use of exotic animals in diplomatic gifts up to modern day Chinese panda diplomacy perhaps deserves a quick parenthetical comment. A good diplomatic gift needs to be something special. Morse, looking at gift exchanges in Melanesia, found that highly specific items were gifted, quite unlike the useful gifts exchanged in the same societies through bargaining. Islamic art expert Doris Berenzer Abu Saif, in a study of the gift giving of the Mamluks, identifies as a central priority in the choice of gift the concept of tuhaf, or marvels, the ability of a gift to generate a sense of wonder. So as tall as a house, with a neck of fantastical length, the giraffe was perfectly suited to the role of providing an object of wonder from audiences unfamiliar with the creature. A giraffe was the star gift among a range of animals given by the Mamluk Sultan Kakebay to Lorenzo de' Medici in 1487. This was a personal gift from ruler to ruler, the Mamluk Sultan seeking Lorenzo's support in persuading the French to give the half-brother of the Ottoman Sultan to his care. Lorenzo was keen for the citizens of Florence to have the chance to see the giraffe, but this was in order to demonstrate to them the extent of his international power and influence. The gift of another giraffe in 1826 from Muhammad Ali Pasha, governor of Egypt, to Charles X, King of France, while formerly also a gift between rulers, paid much more heed to its wider impact on the French public. The Egyptian governor was seeking not only the sympathy of the French king for his cause, but that of the French people as a whole. So the giraffe was housed in the Jardin des Plantes, open to the public, unlike the royal menageries of old. Giraffe mania took hold in France, with gingerbread biscuits created in giraffe shapes, and even a lady's hairstyle a la giraffe. And you can still see the animal itself, the stuffed creature. It resides in the National History Museum in La Rochelle. And just one more fabulous gift, the Amber Room. It's a chamber panelled in amber, given in 1716 by Friedrich Wilhelm I, king in Prussia, to his ally Peter the Great. It was a gift aiming to impress a foreign ruler about Prussian craftsmanship, destined for the interior of a royal palace. Peter's return gift, incidentally, included 55 giant soldiers, responding to a known obsession of the Prussian king, who filled a regiment with tall people, earning it the name of the Potsdam Giants. And the Amber Room was looted by the Nazis from the Catherine Palace south of St. Petersburg, and then it kind of disappeared in the chaos of the Soviet assault on Königsberg at the end of the Second World War. There were years of abortive attempts to try and find the thing in Baltic shipwrecks and Saxon mine workings. And eventually the Soviet authorities gave up the cause and embarked on the challenging process of reconstructing it. They ran out of money and the project was going nowhere when it was rescued by a gift of $3.5 million in 1999 from the German company Ruhrgas. 2003, at an event many on the German side would probably now wish to forget, Russian President Putin and the German Chancellor Schröder formally opened the room as part of the St. Petersburg Tercentenary celebrations, a private gift supporting a public diplomacy, but one that showcased now Russian rather than Prussian craftsmanship. And the choice of gifts, especially particularly prestigious ones, increasingly involves a much greater degree of public participation. So the Japanese gift of cherry trees to Washington in 1912 followed years of lobbying from a private citizen and Japanophile called Eliza Ruhama Skidmore. A cause was then taken up by David Fairchild at the US Department of Agriculture, Nellie Taft, the wife of the US president, and Jokichi Takamine, a US-based Japanese chemist. The Statue of Liberty started out as a private initiative, only later taken up by the governments involved. And the Merci train of 1949, which was a French thank you gift for the post-war support received through the US Friendship Train initiative, was the idea of a French war veteran named André Picard. French officials then took up the idea. And public engagement in the selection of a diplomatic gift perhaps reached its apogee in the campaign in Norway to gift Finland a mountain peak for its centenary celebrations in 2017. The idea was that of a retired employee of the Norwegian Mapping Authority, who noted that Finland's highest point was a kind of nondescript bit of mountain slope, and you only had to move the border 40 meters to give it an actual peak. And he suggested this. A Facebook group was formed, Halty as an anniversary gift, and the local mayor weighed in support. This episode did, though, I think, reveal the limits of public participation in gift selection. It got nowhere, the government determining that Norway's borders were inviolable. So I think we can come to a conclusion, a kind of general conclusion, that gifts remain a part of diplomacy, but their nature's changed. They've moved from items of material value, powering diplomatic exchange and the construction and maintenance of the social relationships at the heart of it, to items of mostly symbolic value, diplomatic signals, whose purpose might be symbolically to acknowledge a positive social relationship. They might also have a public diplomacy function in highlighting the soft power of the gifting country. The most important of today's diplomatic gifts are oriented towards the publics of gifting and receiving countries, and may involve an element of public participation in their creation, gifts serving as thank yous, or to highlight a particularly valued relationship. So that's, I hope that sets the scene for the discussion.
For sure. Well, I think there's so much there's so much to latch onto there, Paul. One thing that really struck me in the book was how giving somebody something that was secondhand can actually be a tremendous move if you're giving an object that has a history. And you mentioned a couple of those cases where part of the gift is enhanced by having been given before.
Absolutely. And I mean, a particularly interesting example is items that have been worn. So one of the items often solicited from Mamluk rulers, for example, was a shirt which had been worn by the Sultan. And I think that was almost regarded as a kind of VIP version of the robe of honor, really, given a particularly close relationship between close personal relationship between the giver and the recipient. Although I think it was one Mamluk Sultan, I think it was Sultan Barsbay, who was a particularly militaristic figure who actually, when asked for a shirt that he'd worn personally, he replied by giving back a gift of a suit of armor, which sort of made the same point, but did so in a way that suggested a bit of strength and power behind that as well.
But one of the ways in which this intersects with public diplomacy is the rhetoric referencing gifts. So drawing attention to the fact that a previous gift has been given, or an obligation is owed. And I was struck by how sometimes this can cause great offense. I was in South Africa, and South Africa has always had a good relationship with Sweden, in part because of the tremendous Swedish support for anti-apartheid. When Swedish diplomats for a more conservative government in Sweden started saying, well, we gave you this in the past, now we need payback, when they tried to, what would you say, use the memory of a gift to mobilize obligation in the present, that caused a great deal of offense. But I think this referencing of gifts, we often see it here. Think what Americans have given to Europe, or that might be a rhetorical device that is used in speech.
I think I think the kind of history and afterlife of gifts are extremely important, and I think some of the best, most well-chosen and successful diplomatic gifts do deliberately reference previous ones. And one lovely example, I think, is the Resolute desk, which sits in the Oval Office. And actually, this all started with the loss of Lord Franklin's expedition in the Arctic. And this was a great sort of cause of the 19th century, the hundreds of, well, not, large numbers of expeditions sent to find him. And one of the ships on one of the expeditions sent to find him itself got stuck. It was HMS Resolute, and it got stuck in the ice and was abandoned, and was eventually picked up by an American whaling ship that sort of towed it back. And the US government at the time had the brilliant idea of gifting the ship back to the UK, and it was sailed across the Atlantic, and Queen Victoria met the ship when it arrived in the UK, and it was a great success. And then the UK had the equally brilliant idea that when the ship was eventually scuppered, they turned some of its timbers into a desk, and then this was presented by Queen Victoria to President Rutherford Hayes, and it's been an outstandingly successful gift and sits in the Oval Office still, kind of referencing the relationship between the countries.
How do you see gifts as related to sacrifice? Because one of the thoughts I had reading this was how in religious rhetoric, there's a lot of emphasis on gifts, and also in religious practice, a sacrifice is kind of a gift that you give to God. So it seems to be such an important part of human power relationships that we're using it to relate hierarchically within families, to establish new relationships, and also for whatever you say, relationships between heaven and earth are using gifts, the language of gifts and sacrifices. And then in religions, you talk about God giving to you, sacrificing for your benefit. It seems to be something that really goes to the heart of what it is to imagine yourself in social relationships of all kinds of dynamics of power.
Yeah, I think, though I think this does speak to the sort of thesis of gifts sort of declining in importance over time, or declining kind of material value over time. I mean, if you look at Morse's writings, I mean, he spends quite a lot of time investigating the potlatch of northwestern United States and northwestern Canada, and one of the central features of the potlatch is in kind of economic terms, it makes no sense at all, in that gifts are, items gifted are way more than the gifting communities can reasonably afford. They are a huge kind of sacrifice in that sense. And actually, I think that, sort of looking at the history of the diplomatic gifts, I think one of the central things that I really found was that the history is about the kind of taming of that, and you would find very few gifts in that category nowadays. I think they are all very much sort of more manageable. They are very much within sort of budgeted lines. There are none that would be so lavish as to sort of embarrass giver or receiver these days.
But it's funny, you talking about embarrassment reminded me of the story of the ivory-handled sword that was given to John Major. Did you ever hear that story?
No, tell me.
So after the liberation of Kuwait, the royal family wanted to give a magnificent present to John Major for his role in the Gulf War. So they presented this ivory-handled sword, which created an immediate diplomatic problem because it is illegal to facilitate the transition of ivory across international frontiers. And so they didn't know what they were going to do. And then somebody at number 10 Downing Street had this bright idea, and they declared the mantelpiece in the downstairs reception room at Downing Street to be Kuwaiti soil. So that meant that the sword didn't have to leave Kuwaiti territory to be received and displayed. So technically that mantelpiece with the sword resting on it is Kuwaiti soil inside number 10 Downing Street, and therefore the problem of being unable to accept a gift was avoided.
That kind of puts me in mind of an example where there was a gift kind of which I think deliberately aimed to cause embarrassment in order to highlight a law that the gifting country wanted to change, which was an Indian gift of mangoes from one Indian minister, I think it was a minister of agriculture, to his Japanese counterpart at a meeting in Paris. And the challenge for the Japanese was that it had banned the import of Indian mangoes for kind of phytosanitary rules, which was a ban that the Indians were desperately trying to lift. And so this put the Japanese in a complete quandary. And they didn't want to refuse the gift for reasons to, not to cause offence, but equally they couldn't take it back to Japan because of the, they would be breaking their own laws by doing so. So the Japanese made a great point of saying, well, thank you for the mangoes which we have all consumed while on our meeting in Paris.
We should remind people to use the Q&A function to ask questions. Now, my favorite story in the book is the Oliver Franks commenting on what his ideal gift would be. Could you tell the audience that story?
Yes, so Oliver Franks was a key thing to know about Oliver Franks is he is a public servant of what great reputation, enormous standing, but he was a very, he wasn't a natural born comedian. He was a very much kind of a very right and very proper sort of Briton. And the story comes, he was ambassador to Washington sort of just after the Second World War. And the story goes that he was, one night he was sort of working late at the embassy, and his secretary sort of came in and said, well, the local radio station in Washington is doing a feature on Christmas, and it's just asked you, what you'd like for Christmas. And Oliver Franks sort of half heard that and said, oh, well, what would I like for Christmas? And he sort of gave a little bit of thought and then replied. And so the program then aired and said, right, and we asked, the presenter asked, we asked ambassadors across Washington, what they would wish for Christmas. And the Soviet ambassador announced that he would wish for an end to enslaved people worldwide. The French ambassador wished for peace throughout the world, and the British ambassador wished for a small box of crystallized fruit.
Yes. And of course, what we should all wish for Christmas is the tremendous book on gifts written
Absolutely.
by Ambassador Brummell. Some questions. Sherry wondered if you could share a few examples of more contemporary gifts that you think of as especially creative.
Yeah. So I'll give some examples of British US gift giving, actually, but they just to kind of demonstrate the continuing importance of reciprocity and the sort of continuing importance of getting it right. And first of all, there was a gift exchange between Gordon Brown, our Prime Minister, and our then Prime Minister, and then US President Barack Obama. And it links to the story I was giving earlier about the Resolute desk. And Gordon Brown had clearly given a great deal of thought to the gift he wanted to give to President Obama. And he came up with the commissioning papers for HMS Resolute, all sort of nicely framed, together with a pen holder made from the timbers of HMS Gannet, which was another ship commissioned at the same naval dockyard as HMS Resolute. The problem was that they'd clearly not been clear coordination with the US side on reciprocity. The gift they got back, or the gift he got back from the US president, was a set of DVDs of classic American movies. And the UK press really sort of decided that this hadn't been properly reciprocated. Not least there was a question mark about whether the DVDs would actually play on UK DVD players, but I'm not sure was finally answered. So when David Cameron, as next UK president, made his first trip to Washington, there'd clearly been very close coordination, and both leaders gave the others contemporary artworks, and the UK gave a work by an artist who's a kind of graffiti artist called Ben Einek, called 21st Century City, you know, a very contemporary piece, but also one that kind of symbolically kind of referenced the US as really being the place of origin of this sort of art. And Barack Obama responded with a lithograph by Ed Rausch, you know, very with red, white, and blue coloring, sort of the colors of both the UK and the US flags. And the next visit, or there was then President Obama had his state visit to the UK, and then the following year there was another visit of David Cameron to Washington. And this time they really had coordinated in an amazing way, because the two gifts both sort of riffed back on President Obama's previous state visit to the UK. And the state visit to the UK had included a barbecue in the garden of Number 10, and two leaders had played table tennis together in a school in London. And so David Cameron gave his gift to President Obama was a table tennis table, and President Obama's gift back was a barbecue set. So it was a really kind of, you know, just emphasizing the sort of personal nature of the relationship, and hinting about, you know, the fact that the state visit had gone really well from both sides. I thought a really, really nice, thoughtful, well chosen set of gifts.
My colleague at USC, Matthew Asada, who's our diplomat in residence at the moment, asks, how does the FCDO and Downing Street and the royal family work together for contemporary gift exchange? And can you give examples for the deciding gifts in your own experience? Because I guess that you had royal visits when you were in the Caribbean. Were gifts part of that, and how did the process work?
Yeah, so the royal households are probably, I'll have to say this carefully, but probably the most sophisticated of the three, or certainly they give an enormous amount of thought to gift giving, and are very meticulous in keeping records of gifts that are given, and that is not least in order to make sure that they don't replicate gifts, because obviously, you know, Her late Majesty was our head of state for for 70 years. So during that time, she met a number of people more than once, and so, you know, there was and is a real premium in royal households on sort of making sure that that records are kept. Typically, a first gift from a member of the royal family will often include a signed photograph of, usually of different sizes according to the importance of the recipient. But other gifts, will typically involve a conversation with the embassy in the recipient country about, what would be appropriate, things to watch out for. Thoughts on what would be a good gift, anything that should be excluded, your kind of ivory point, which what sort of substance, materials or items would go down particularly badly in the country concerned. That's done particularly for sort of really key visits at the political level from, number 10 in the Foreign Office would certainly sort of go through similar processes. Where I think, to be honest, where I think we're a bit weaker is what I might call the kind of more routine visits, which is often where gifts are often a little bit of an afterthought, and often ministers' offices will have sometimes a quite unimaginative set of items that they bring or take with them. But so we're certainly not, we don't get everything perfectly. I think there is.
Joan Mauer asks about or mentions that right now the House is investigating President Trump's gifts that went unreported. And there's a story of a gift, a fur coat brought in by a Bush staffer, so gifts can be a source of corruption. Has this always been so? Maybe you should talk a little bit about the problems that France had with, was it Giscard d'Estaing who received the diamonds?
The diamonds from President Bokassa, yes. This was so this is... Yeah, I mean, this is a big potential concern of, when does a gift become a bribe? And that's why so many states, including the UK, including the United States, have limits on the value of gifts that can be received by public officials. And so France, or the then French President Giscard d'Estaing, became particularly unstuck. He had developed... I mean, I think there's a kind of quite long tradition in post-war France of the presidential administration running policy towards sub-Saharan Africa. This was, because so many of the countries were French colonies, during and immediately following the decolonialization process, the kind of personal relationships with the new leaders were absolutely central, and these were often led by the presidents themselves. And that had its advantages, but it also could have its disadvantages, where the heads of state they were dealing with turned out to be increasingly beyond the pale. And this happened in spades with Jean Bedel Bokassa, who, was in his background, he was a highly decorated French military officer. But then when he became leader of the Central African Republic, he rapidly moved to dictatorship, proclaiming himself emperor, crowning himself as the Central African emperor and spending exorbitant amounts on his Napoleonic-styled coronation. His excesses just became too much. There are many reports of murders, including the report of murders of some protesting school children in a dispute over payment for school uniforms. The French overthrew Bokassa in a coup, and having done so, his excesses became really clear, including allegations of cannibalism, the deaths of people eaten by crocodiles in the grounds of his palace. I mean, all sorts of dreadful stuff. Bokassa was very upset that his former friend had been involved in deposing him, so set about to try and sink Giscard d'Estaing, and brought up the subject of the diamonds he'd given Giscard as gifts in the past. Giscard made various attempts to sort of belittle the value of these, or he, just before the 1981 French presidential election, he had a really appallingly unsuccessful sort of TV appearance where he basically said, no, they were just little stones. They were barely worth the name diamonds at all. In any case, I gave the donation to charity, so nothing to worry about here. Which absolutely satisfied nobody, and in the end Mitterrand won the elections. And so I think Giscard discovered that certainly diamonds are forever, but so too are the circumstances in which they're given.
Very good. Joel Fishman wants to know whether there have been contemporary problems of gifts being improperly reciprocated, where there's an asymmetry of value. reciprocal gifts of unequal value. Has that come up recently?
Yes, I mean, I think the example I gave of the sort of Gordon Brown, Barack Obama gift exchange was one where certainly the British press felt that the gift had been sort of asymmetrically reciprocated. The gifts from Middle Eastern rulers pose problems because I think just to give an example of gifts to US presidents, I mean, this is a system which operates, or at least ostensibly operates, in a very transparent way. The gifts are record above a certain value, I think a defined minimal threshold value, which I think is about $415, have to be recorded in the Federal Register of Gifts to US officials. This is published every year, so you can read them. And that is also an attempt to kind of dissuade foreign leaders from giving particularly sort of lavish gifts. But one source that very rarely complies is the Middle East, and particularly Saudi Arabia. And so there have often been challenges for US presidents where particularly expensive gifts are seen being received from Middle Eastern leaders, although of course they're not kept personally, but are given to the archive. So that I think there's really kind of no question of trying to reciprocate that sort of largesse because it just wouldn't be seen as appropriate to do so. So I think in those cases gifts are kind of left asymmetrical, and sometimes more junior figures like ambassadors can face problems there. I think while our former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, a man called Sharad Kauper-Coles, in his autobiography, wrote of taking accompanying a Saudi sheikh on a hunting trip, and he made the cardinal error of sort of forgetting himself and saying, oh, what a beautiful falcon that is, and of course, then later on that evening, it was presented to him, and he found the dilemma of what on earth to do with a falcon worth probably $250,000, which he, way above the value he's allowed to keep. He couldn't refuse it for not causing offence. So in the end, what he had to do was sort of keep the falcon on the grounds of the British Embassy and feed it very large numbers of mice and use it to kind of entertain visiting British ministers. But
well, that just goes to show, doesn't it? You have to be. The diplomat, the true diplomat, can never relax or speak a word without thought.
Yes.
Very, very good. Well, Paul, thanks so much. I should say, as we round things off, which was the most fun of all these gifts, the 50 gifts in your book, which was the most fun to research?
It's a really interesting question. I think one of the most unusual which comes to mind is a gift which was made as an apology, which was a gift of a very large diamond made by the Shah of Iran to the Emperor of Russia. And it was actually an attempt a successful attempt to stop Russia invading Iran after the Iranians, after a kind of riot in Iran, in Tehran, caused the death of the Russian envoy. It was a poet and a playwright called Gribiyedov. But he had come to Tehran, following the cessation of previous hostilities between the two countries. He'd had quite a sticky time, but he reached nearly the end of it. But his sort of time in Tehran was undone by a Armenian eunuch at the Shah's court, who decided that he wanted to seek the protection of the Russian envoy, so sort of fled to the fled away from the harem to the Russian diplomatic representation, and there were lots of rumors that he'd taken lots of treasures from the Shah in doing so. And so the mullahs of Iran rose up against this, and they burnt the whole place down and killed the envoy. So hastily the Shah dispatched the crown prince to St. Petersburg bearing a very large diamond, and managed to persuade the Tsar not to invade.
Greta Morris raises an interesting question, and that's about gifts being refused. What are the examples of gifts being refused, and can that be managed?
So, I mean, I think, so just to give an example of, my own experience, I think there are certain circumstances, for diplomats today where a gift would have to be refused. And they would include any gift that, came from somebody seeking a visa, or,
right,
clearly sort of linking it to something that they wanted. So gifts that were not really gifts, but were made in a kind of transactional sense. Obviously, anything above the kind of threshold value is problematic. But other than a gift from a power with which we don't have diplomatic relations, it's quite difficult to sort of physically refuse a gift. So I think it would normally be, in my experience, they would normally be kind of accepted, but then you would, if the gift is at all problematic, you would do a great kind of narrative around what you've physically done with it and make sure that's very well documented.
So, but Prince Philip got the famous, what was it called? A penis sheath from in the South Pacific.
The Vanna Islanders, yes, indeed, yes. Yes, no, I don't think he could. Okay. It was accepted. No, I think it was accepted. I mean, I'm not sure what the grounds for refusal would have been. It didn't fit or something.
Well, just thank goodness he didn't appear wearing it. That's all you can. But no.
Okay. But I think it was, I mean, the Vanna Islands it's a fascinating example. I mean, the Vanna Islanders actually sort of worshipped him effectively as an individual. So had this very close relationship with him, and their gift was a sign of respect from them to him, and I think it was accepted in those terms.
As you and I know, as parents, you have to accept some strange gifts.
Indeed,
pictures made of what do you call it, of pasta, and one learns how to take a gift in the spirit in which it's intended.
Indeed, absolutely.
It was a lovely book, Paul. Thanks so much for writing it, and thanks for taking time today to talk about it. And it's certainly something that I know I'll be directing the students to, and you did a tremendous job of work, and I'm amazed that you didn't have the idea to write it until 2019. So many academics take much longer than that to create something of equivalent value without working as diplomats at the same time. So many congratulations. Just as I bring things to a conclusion, I want to flag what's happening next time we meet, which will be on the first Monday of December. And we've got a special session dealing with the history of broadcasting to the Soviet Union, looking at history and precedent. And it's going to bring together a panel of experts on Cold War broadcasting who have all recently written, I think, important publications. Mark Pomar of the Clements Center in Texas. He's a veteran of VOA, RFERL, has written Cold War Radio, the Russian broadcasts of Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Gene Parter, a veteran of RFERL, has written Under the Radar, Tracking Western Radio Listeners in the Soviet Union. Michelle S. Daniel, who's a musician and podcaster, has written The DJ Who Brought Down the USSR, The Life and Legacy of Sever Novgorodtsev. And they will be joined for a response from my colleague Vasily Khartov of the Center for Communication, Leadership and Policy here at USC, who's a long-time listener to broadcasting during the Soviet era, but has a special distinction of being one of the jammers who, as a national serviceman, attempted to jam US and UK radio broadcasts into the Soviet Union in the 1980s. So I think that's a wonderful lineup to think about what's an increasingly significant subject today. So thank you very much. Thanks, Paul. Thanks to our tech hosts and to the audience for wonderful questions.
Thanks all.